So what makes a good user story? Agile seems to be full of clever little acronyms. And the clever little acronym that helps us sort of polish a user story so that it's a good one is the acronym SMART, which means that the story is specific. In other words, it describes a behavior in sufficient detail and specificity that basically someone who doesn't know anything about the app could, like a robot, follow the story and try to actually induce the behavior in the application. Measurable. There needs to be a way to know definitively when the user story has been implemented successfully. So basically, you give somebody a copy of the app, they should be able to answer unequivocally yes or no, does the app currently implement this story? Achievable. Can you write it? Ideally, it's something that you can do in one iteration. And we will talk about ways to break down stories so that if you can't do the whole thing in one iteration, you can break it down so that each iteration you deliver some piece of it. Relevant. This is the business value part. Why is it worth spending developer time to do this story? And in a moment, we'll talk about what they call the 5 whys, which is one way to determine relevance. And lastly, time boxed, knowing when to give up. If you get mired in implementing a user story that you thought was not going to be complicated, usually that's telling you something about the design of your app. Something that you thought was going to be straightforward turns out to be hard and starts dragging out and taking longer than you think it should. Having a time limit saying, okay, if the story is not done by this time, something must be wrong. Let's go back to the drawing board and figure out how we should fix it. Okay. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time boxed. So what is specific and measurable? Like I said, if you can write a step-by-step process that someone who doesn't know anything about the app can actually verify if the behavior works or not. So, for example, a bad user story, sort of laughably bad, would be something like, the UI should be more user-friendly. First of all, that's very subjective, right? But how would you sort of put somebody in front of the app and say, okay, the requirement is the UI should be user-friendly. Go play with the app and tell me if it is or not. That's not at all specific. And there's, are there particular parts of the UI that are a problem? Is there a particular workflow that's confusing? A better example is to break down the story in terms of givens, whens, and thens. So what this means is, given some state of the world, or some state of the app, when the user takes some very specific action, then certain things should happen, or certain things should not happen, right? So it's basically setting up some preconditions, taking some action, and then verifying that certain post-conditions are the case. And by the way, it is not a coincidence that if you could write the story in those terms, you could also imagine writing an automated test for that story. And that's actually exactly where we're going. So that's specific and measurable. What about achievable? Ideally, whatever your iteration time is, and 1 or 2 weeks is typical in Agile, it would be great if you can finish a story within an iteration. If not, you can divide it into multiple stories, and the collection of stories together form what is sometimes called an epic. This is epic in its original sense of a long saga, not epic in the sense of amazing, spectacular, and wonderful. And the goal is to have working code at the end of each iteration. So it should not be the case that checking in part of a story causes something to break. Now, it could be the case that checking in a story that doesn't completely fulfill the feature, in other words, there's still other stories in the epic, maybe the result of doing that is not visible to the end user. Maybe there's a workflow that the end user has to see, but there's no way to have them try the workflow until all the stories in it are implemented, and that could take more than one iteration. And that's fine, but as you incrementally roll the functionality in, even if it's not immediately visible to the end user, it shouldn't break everything. And if you find that your team is consistently delivering less than one story per iteration, then you probably need to improve your estimation of points, which we're going to talk about as how you decide how long a user story is going to take. Related to achievable is time box. Like we said, if you expect the story to be finished in an iteration and it starts dragging out for reasons you didn't anticipate, sometimes that's telling you something about your design, that you didn't really understand well enough what the requirements to do that story would be, and it's time to go back to the drawing board. And then relevance, finally. So what are the 5 whys? If we go back to our example of, from the box office manager's point of view, why do they want to show the patrons' social network friends? It's so that they can induce patrons to buy a ticket. So if I were to ask, well, let me push back on that a little bit. Why do you think that this will induce patrons to buy a ticket? Well, I think more people would go if they thought that their friends would go, and they'll probably enjoy the show more. Okay, well, why does it matter if they enjoy the show more? So you basically push back on each question. Well, I think if they enjoy the show more, they're more likely to come back for other shows. So, it means we sell more tickets. Okay, why do you want to sell more tickets? Well, if I sell more tickets, the theater makes more money. Why is it important for the theater to make more money? Well, we don't want to go out of business. And why does it matter that you don't want to go out of business? Well, because then I don't have a job. Basically, if you can get to 5 of these, you've probably vetted the story and there's a good reason to do it. It seems obvious when you write it down, but it's surprising how many stories sort of run out of gas after the first why, and it's hard to justify. So sitting down with a customer and really sort of pushing back on this a little bit, and it also will sometimes, the customer will sometimes realize that what they're asking for maybe is not as important as they thought it was. And even if the story doesn't get ditched, maybe it means that it gets prioritized lower. So given those criteria, here's a few stories, and I'm going to ask you to weigh in on how smart they are. How about, with respect to our old friend Rotten Potatoes, user can search for a movie by title. How smart? Smart or not smart? Okay, so I could have a different feature. But if I'm just restricting it to searching for a movie by title, just that feature, are there things missing from this description in terms of making it specific or making it measurable? For example, this doesn't say anything about what if there are multiple matches? What if there are no matches? How should the result be displayed? So it's not bad. I mean, you can certainly figure out what it means, but if you actually had to sit down and implement it, it's not quite specific enough, right? At some point, you're going to have to answer these questions as a developer, so it would be better to capture them in the story. What about this one? Given I have a free movie pass, I want to redeem it for an eligible movie before it expires. Or, as a potential developer looking at the story, is this smart enough for you to say, okay, I'm pretty sure I can go off and implement that? What questions would you have as a developer if somebody gave you the job of go off and implement this story? What does it mean for a movie to be eligible? That's one question. It's, now maybe there's some other user story elsewhere also related to the app that makes it very clear what eligible means, but it's something that I would ask. And also, one of the things that you sort of, at least that I stumbled over when I began using this is the way that I do development. And by the way, this is absolutely the way that I do development, is that I would say something like, given I have a free movie pass, I want to redeem it for an eligible movie. Those are all indefinite articles. A specific one would be, given I have a movie pass that is valid on these dates and is redeemable for this subset of movies, I want to redeem it to go see Exorcist 3 Awakening or whatever the new Exorcist is that's gotten terrible, terrible reviews, but I'm going to see it anyway because I love the franchise. But basically, specific is, I actually am going to pre-populate the system with specific movies, specific passes, specific rules about eligibility, and then I'm going to use the names of those specific things in the story because that makes the story specific. That's something that is potentially implementable. How about this? When I do the add movie workflow, 99% of the page loads of that workflow should appear within 3 seconds. It's a different kind of user story because it doesn't speak to the same stakeholder, right? But who would you say is the stakeholder that is being implicated in this third story? Which stakeholder would come up with a story like this that they wanted to make sure was implemented properly? Suppose you're running RottenPotatoes.com, RottenPotatoes.app, and you stand to make money if users are happy with the site experience. If your site loads really slowly, users might be upset. They might not come back. In fact, Google did a bunch of experiments a bunch of years ago to show just how sensitive users are to being impatient about page loads. So you can imagine, for example, like the marketing person or the person who serves ads on the page or something, they're the one who cares that the users have a good experience. So it's basically like, look, having the right stuff appear when the user's at a movie, those stories are someone else's issue. My issue is I want it to be fast, right? And this is actually pretty specific because you can imagine running a whole bunch of simulations where you load the pages in this flow and measure how often is it the case that the page loads come back within the threshold amount of time. So I think this is a pretty reasonably smart story. There might be some things you'd have to clarify, but it's a little unusual because it speaks to a different stakeholder, right? It's easy to think that the only stakeholder is the end user or something like that. That's not always true. By the way, in none of those stories did we talk about business value. Maybe in the third one because, ads and the users want to be happy. But the idea that free movie passes and redeeming them is important, we didn't talk about that, right? We're assuming that when the user, whichever stakeholder proposed that story, we're assuming that we went through the 5 whys and the story has sort of earned the right to be here. So we're just talking about whether these are specific measurable, and achievable, but we're sort of assuming that they've already passed the test for being relevant. One of the ways that you can help sort of get specific with the second story, given I have a free movie pass, as opposed to given I have a movie pass that has these specific criteria. One way that you as a developer can sort of bridge this gap from natural language to thinking about the class design of your app, Agile seems to have a penchant for index cards. And so here's another one. This is a class, responsibility, and collaborator card, which basically tries to summarize when you're designing a new class in order to help implement some part of a user story, what are the things that this class is responsible for knowing? What information does it keep track of? So for example, here's a hypothetical class. It's actually not hypothetical. It's a class from an app that I maintain. And one of the things the app does, in fact, is it sells tickets for performances. Those tickets are internally, they're called vouchers. So that's the name of the class. And examples of things that a voucher has to know. It has to know whether it's reserved for a show or not reserved. It has to know whether fulfillment is needed. In other words, is there something that has to be mailed to the customer, or is it just like an e-ticket? Whether that customer has checked in, like did they show up at the theater and present their ticket for the show? What does the class know how to do? For example, a voucher has to know how to reserve itself, how to cancel itself. It has to know how to enumerate the dates on which it can be used if it's a special voucher, whether it's changeable once it's been sold or not. And what other classes does it collaborate with? So for example, in order for the voucher to know whether it's reserved, there must be some class that models a particular performance and whether there are seats available. Because without that information, you can't reserve the voucher. So it's the voucher's job to know if it's reserved and to try to reserve itself. But in order to do that, it has to collaborate with at least one other class, in this case, one called show date, because only the show date knows which seats are available. So if you can get to the level where you're sort of writing out, sketching what are the main responsibilities of the class and which existing classes does it have to collaborate with, this is one way to sort of help make your design concrete when you're trying to map the elements that are in a user story to how you're going to implement those in the app.